Thanks, Michael, and welcome all of you. I am absolutely delighted that our inquiry report was released today, and please do open your packs and take a look at the evidence summary. And without giving away the punchline of our inquiry, one of the most important things that... Is this microphone working okay? One of the most important things, of course, that we need if we're going to lift affordable housing supply in Australia, if we're going to grow affordable housing supply, of course, is political leadership and political commitment. So it was wonderful to see two political leaders here today talking to us for nearly an hour on housing. They have left, but I don't take that as any indication of a lack of commitment, because we've got a very, very long day ahead and a rich and, I believe, very constructive discussion to be had. And I can see many people in the room. I can barely see you through the lights, but I can see a great deal of expertise, a great deal of people who've been working in this sector for a very long time. And that means that we are going to have a very promising discussion today. My job is simply to frame the elements of a large body of research which was based on 3 substantive research projects, which I will touch upon, but I won't go into great detail. We will come back to them later today. But I will talk a little bit more detail as I go through on the ways in which we can use the planning system to help grow the supply of affordable housing. Some context for the inquiry and for this discussion. Of course, we know that Australia's housing system has undergone structural change, which has only really become apparent in the past 2 decades. This is change that is beyond the cycles of the property market, the short-term cycles of the property market. Of course, this is emerging and deep barriers to first-home ownership for people all the way up to moderate incomes and potentially beyond. Of course, it is the deep housing affordability stress faced by households in private rental, and it is the expansion of different types of households not traditionally having needed the types of assistance that are now faced in the private market. Steve Rowley's team's research at Curtin, for instance, pointed out that more than 1.3 million Australian households now are unable to have their needs met in the private market without assistance. And so what that means, of course, for governments is a widening of the ambit around housing assistance and a new way that we need to think about how governments intervene in the market to provide assistance beyond the traditional social and public housing sector. There has, of course, been some innovation, however, over the past 5 years in particular, and that led us to the question that drove the inquiry, essentially how governments have, despite the growing need in the housing system and despite the constrained funding environment, how governments have actually sought to increase the supply of affordable housing across that continuum, that wider group of households now needing assistance, that continuum of housing needs. And the implications, what can be learned from examples of very good practice and perhaps less successful examples as well, what can be learned and transferred across the very different market contexts and policy contexts that characterise Australia. This is the research team. It was a big group of researchers. There were 10 of us across 4 universities, the University of Sydney, the University of New South Wales, Curtin, and even Glasgow for some international input. And I acknowledge the members of the team who are here today. The inquiry model was driven, as I said, by 3 empirical research projects. They were intersecting but discrete, and they focused on different aspects of the ways in which governments may, in conjunction with the sector and indeed private sector, drive affordable housing supply. Firstly, looking at the strategic scale, so the whole of government picture as well as the programmatic individual program level, looking at the planning system scale, so the intersection between affordable housing, social housing and the market through the planning and development process, and also at the project scale when it comes to delivering actual affordable housing projects on the ground. And we were informed in our work, of course, by an expert panel, and I have seen at least Janet Chappell from Urban Growth New South Wales in the audience, but it was an expert panel comprised of Commonwealth, state government experts, as well as sector and industry advice. And our reference point across our inquiry was this continuum of housing needs, by now a very familiar concept to people in this room, but by no means unimportant. And in fact, this actually animated the research across the inquiry, the acknowledgement that we can't only think about very high needs, but nor can we concentrate on the group of households and moderate income households who essentially are receiving a lot of media attention properly, but we need to look across the different stages, and as needs deepen, so too does the need for policy, for subsidy. Understanding that continuum of housing needs and the different types of housing products and options that need to be enabled and catalysed within the housing system to meet those needs gives us a basis for starting to take stock of what has been delivered and where we need to get to when it comes to driving affordable housing supply. And this is the right time to define what I mean when I talk about affordable housing and what we meant in this inquiry when we talk about affordable housing, a very slippery concept, of course, but and a concept that needs clarity, needs definitional clarity. We use the definition in this inquiry that has been used in a number of AHURI studies and underpins many policy definitions of housing that is subject, importantly, to access and eligibility, as well as affordability requirements set by government. And that, of course, includes rental housing that is priced in some way below market rents, although there are different methods for doing that. But it also, in the definition that we use, includes owner-occupied housing that is made available for eligible households and provided via either some type of affordability requirement or subsidy or shared equity arrangement, etc. Now, we make a distinction between affordable housing that is provided subject to those access and eligibility requirements and affordable and lower cost housing that might be delivered in the market. That said, of course, delivering increased supplies of lower cost housing in the market is, of course, something that we very, very much want to see. This is a very desirable, of course, policy objective, but we need to recognise that if affordable or low cost housing delivered by the market is done well, that it's very likely to also be occupied by higher income households, again creating shortage and pushing up prices and rents, meaning that the residual, the housing that falls to the bottom end of the market is often lower cost because it's inadequate, in the wrong location, or inappropriate for the households that we're most concerned about. So now I'm going to flip very quickly through the inquiry, focusing in particular on the inclusionary planning project that I led, but I want to give you a sense of the two other important centrepiece research projects. Across all of the three different projects that I will describe and that we will discuss later today, we adopted a method for housing evaluation research which provides a way of comparing and analysing very, very different approaches at different scales of operation, from a strategy all the way down to an individual housing project, and a way of comparing and understanding the mechanisms that make things work and don't work, and also comparing the outcomes that are delivered. And that's called, sort of in technical terms, the context, understanding the context in which something arises, the key mechanisms that make something work or not work, and of course the outcomes, remembering that we use the continuum of housing needs as the benchmark for understanding and evaluating the different outcomes and the levels of subsidy and other forms of intervention that may have been needed to deliver outcomes across that continuum. The research methods are, as you would expect for a complex piece of multiple intersecting research projects such as this. Obviously case studies, a great deal of analysis of policy documents, individual development decisions in some cases, comparative analysis techniques, and of course lots of interviews with key informants, including many of the experts in this room. Now, the first project in this sort of trifecta of research that made up the inquiry was the question of how governments have sought to actually catalyse market activity and generate industry innovation. We can't, of course, do it all with innovation, however smart and innovative we may be, but we asked the question. And of course this project was led by Steve Rowley, and we will hear more from Steve later today. But just to give you a sampler, Steve looked at two of what I personally would consider to be the high points of state and territorial housing policy innovation over the past 5 or a little bit longer years. The Western Australian Housing Authority's strategy Opening Doors, which very, very quickly met its benchmarks and immediately proceeded to set new targets, which it's gone forward to deliver against. The Affordable Housing Action Plan of the ACT, again, a very comprehensive strategy, a strategy in which many, many different programs came together and by being nested within this strategic approach became more than the sum of their parts. And then two more specific programs in New South Wales and the Northern and Western Australia. Now, in terms of the summary of the findings, as I said, the comprehensive strategic framework absolutely critical to pull together the different policies, subsidy streams, programs and other mechanisms available to government at the intersection between public housing, social housing, affordable housing and private sector housing supply. The significance and the potential of partnerships, mixed tenure projects and of course low cost home ownership being very important in both the ACT and Western Australia. The absolutely fundamentally important policy technique of setting targets, setting measurable outcomes and then reporting against progress to meet those things goes without saying, but so often goes without doing. Of course, the importance of effective leadership and the X factor of innovation and what is blindingly obvious, but again, often in very, very short supply, government funding. Of course, both the Western Australian and the ACT strategies were lifted by two very significant sources of funding that are no longer with us, the National Rental Affordability Scheme and the Social Housing Initiative. Moving on to the third project, I'm going to talk about the second in a moment, but the third project in this inquiry, which looked at the way in which we pay for, to use Bill and his team's terminology, the way that we pay for affordable housing projects on the ground, with two driving questions: how levers and financial arrangements come together at the scale of a particular project, and the different outcomes that might be able to be achieved under different policy, funding and market contexts. They looked in detail at 6 anonymised but highly representative case studies of affordable housing projects in different market contexts. And again, to give you a sort of a haiku version of the findings of that project, one of the unfortunate findings was that, and no surprise to the people in this room, of course, is that under the piecemeal and sort of ad hoc, highly opportunistic approach to funding social and affordable housing in Australia, what happens is really an attempt to pull together projects that are in part driven by the sources of funding that are available rather than driven by a strategic approach to need and delivering across that continuum. The critical factor of land and, of course, access to low-cost finance is absolutely driving affordable supply on the ground. And the fact that the continuum model, thinking across the continuum, of course, offers the opportunity for cross-subsidisation as well as social benefits, but that continuum actually being an important part of business models in many cases. And now what I'm going to spend my last 10 minutes or so talking about the potential role for inclusionary planning, certainly not to fund affordable housing, but to operate as an important support. And so in the project led by me, but carried out by, again, a team of researchers, including Ken Gibb from University of Glasgow in the UK, where they have a much longer and prouder tradition of inclusionary planning than we do in Australia, we asked how governments have used the planning system to attempt to boost the supply of affordable homes and what the outcomes of these approaches have been. And just before I go further, it's worth just saying what I mean by inclusionary planning. It sounds wonderful, it's a warm term, but it means simply making sure that whenever we do new residential development, that we include affordable housing in it, that we don't just assume that new supply means that it will filter down as an affordable outcome. And certainly we can see from the results of the latest housing boom that that doesn't happen on its own. So there's three basic techniques. One is simply requiring developers to include affordable housing units as part of their development for sale or for rent. The second approach is encouraging the private sector to volunteer to include affordable housing. And the third is no less important, but perhaps less impactful, as I will show you. The third is varying planning rules to allow lower cost forms of market housing to be developed. In our project, we looked at the very latest in the UK and the United States. Of course, practice in this space is continuing to evolve, particularly in the context post the global financial crisis, and concern that any requirements through planning systems may be counterproductive by acting as a sort of new regulatory constraint. No evidence of that in the research that we did, but we can discuss that later if people are concerned about. But we looked in particular at the very interesting experiment that New South Wales has been on for nearly 8 years now, with trying to encourage the private sector in the very high value market, particularly in Sydney, in trying to encourage the private sector to voluntarily deliver more affordable rental housing, and the inclusionary zoning, the mandatory approach that's been underway in South Australia for more than a decade now. Just the headlines: in the United States, there are now more than 500 inclusionary planning schemes which require or incentivise developers in cities across the United States to provide affordable housing whenever land essentially is rezoned for higher density development, whenever urban renewal efforts are happening, whenever there's investment in major infrastructure, such as, for instance, a rail line. San Francisco, great example, long-term inclusionary planning scheme requiring 12 to 20% of all homes in new development to be affordable, has yielded a pipeline of around about 12% of new housing supply in San Francisco has been in the affordable rental or home ownership sector. The UK model, again, also a very long-term model, very ambitious model, particularly in high markets such as London, where there's pretty much a starting point expectation that 30% of development on major sites will be provided as affordable rental, ownership, shared equity, etc. This was a model that was shaken by the global financial crisis because, of course, one of the things that should be said about inclusionary planning is that it is pro-cyclical. When you're working with the market, when you're working with new residential development, you get more units when the market is booming, when more houses are being developed. That's one of the tricks around how you design a good inclusionary planning model, which aims to try and stabilise housing production and actually work with developers to create a pipeline of of housing units, irrespective of what the market is doing. We've seen that in the United Kingdom, and just as a taster, 43% of affordable housing supply, so an additional 43% of the UK's quite high by world standards affordable housing output last year was provided through the planning system in the form of affordable rental, home ownership, and a range of models across the continuum. The important features of the English model have been a long-term planning, commitment to planning, long-term funding, of course, for affordable housing, and a very strong, independent, now social housing sector. So turning to what our practice has been in Australia, actually quite encouraging if we look at the model of South Australia, which simply announced in 2005 that from that point forward, 15% of all homes in new residential communities were to be affordable. That's delivered via an affordable housing target and price thresholds which are set annually, published in the Government Gazette, and they are set at the price that a moderate income household would be able to afford, able to be purchased by those households or by an affordable housing provider. The requirement introduced when land is rezoned for residential or higher density residential development. Now, the outcomes have been impressive. It is a target, it is negotiated on a site-by-site case basis, but the data available to us shows that between 15 to 17% actually they've exceeded their target of houses produced and committed, so the pipeline of homes have been affordable by that criteria. And they've been delivered across the continuum, including social and affordable housing, but also importantly low-cost home ownership as well. Now in New South Wales, the news isn't quite as promising. As I mentioned, there was 2 experiments that we were particularly keen to examine. The tantalising notion that you could encourage the private sector to voluntarily commit and provide affordable housing supply through incentives, through the planning system. And 2 particular mechanisms, a voluntary planning agreement that is able to be negotiated when land is being rezoned or when planning rules are varied. This was introduced in 2006, as well as density or floor space bonuses introduced for projects incorporating affordable rental housing, introduced from 2009. Now these, as well as some concessions in the planning system, which I will show you in a moment, these have been underway since 2009. In addition, of course, in New South Wales, there's been a very long-running inclusionary zoning scheme operating in parts of central Sydney. I won't speak about that because it hasn't been extended to date, although perhaps that will happen in the next year or so, we hope. We hope so because the incentive approach hasn't achieved very much over the past 9 years, hasn't achieved nothing. We've been able to count through painstaking analysis of development decisions and voluntary planning agreements, the actual agreements. There's been no tally of this, but we estimate that at least roughly 1,300, perhaps more, but certainly no more than 1% of the entire supply of Sydney's housing stock over the past 10 years, over the operation of these policies at least, have been affordable rental housing. And I should pause to say when I say affordable rental housing now, I'm actually talking about really an NRAS definition of affordable rental housing. So this is housing that must be rented at a 20% discount to eligible households for at least 10 years. And this is the definition of affordable rental housing that I'm using when I say that we have delivered in New South Wales under our incentive program around about 1,300 additional affordable units through the density bonus. In addition, under the planning concessions enabled under the affordable rental housing SEP, we've also achieved nearly 3,000 new generation boarding house rooms, which I will show you in a moment, as student housing accommodation. So this is a sort of a new form of low-cost market housing that there is certainly industry interest in and some potential for, I think, as well as the big big headline outcome from our affordable rental housing SEP in New South Wales has been a boom in granny flats, secondary dwellings, rear extensions or detached cottages in backyards. So if you want to do that, New South Wales can show you how to. The new generation boarding houses are really a form of micro rental accommodation, minimum of 12 square metres for singles, 13 metres squared for couples, targeting people who perhaps are singles and couples and students. The benefit for industry, of course, is that you can produce micro apartments which cost less. They can't be strated off, so they are purely a rental product, but currently there are no affordability requirements around this. So some generous planning concessions. The affordability outcome is certainly not clear, unless, of course, they're being developed, as many are, by affordable housing providers. Granny flats, as I said, a boon primarily in middle and western suburbs. We have no way of answering the question of whether granny flats are serving the needs of our highest needs households or not, but we've delivered a lot under our affordable rental housing policy. So in summary, and I will start to wrap up both in terms of the inclusionary planning project that I led, but also the wider inquiry. In summary, in relation to inclusionary planning, the news is good, not bad, despite the somewhat depressing picture of New South Wales. There is potential, and in fact I think there's an absolute obligation now to expand inclusionary planning wherever we have high growth. Residential development projects, particularly in our major cities, but there's certainly potential in regional areas as well. Of course, our inclusionary planning schemes need to be working with the grain of supply programs and targeted to local market conditions. Overall, the inquiry points to the need, and those of you who've already had a look at the inquiry report or the summary in your findings, you'll see that it's absolutely essential and overdue for us to move to a national housing strategy. No surprise, it's not rocket science. We need a strategic framework to pull together the different policies, funding arrangements, subsidies and levers available to government, and to integrate the way that we deal with housing across the continuum. And we need to talk about a housing system now, not simply a particular sector of that system. Our strategy needs to be underpinned, of course, by strong political leadership. It, of course, needs to involve all levels of government. It needs to drive wider supply, but fundamentally through an expanded affordable housing industry. We won't get anywhere without secure long-term finance, as well as a mechanism to pull it together. We, of course, need the finance, and a greater use of inclusionary planning to underpin our access to land and development. We have some very important inspiration from long-term national strategic approaches to housing in the United Kingdom, the latest very inspirational approach from Canada, all of course underpinned by increased funding commitment, very strong, very cohesive political leadership, and an absolute commitment to expanding supply by expanding the affordable housing sector. So to conclude, what we need to see in our national housing strategy are high-level targets, but across the continuum. We need to build the community housing sector, of course. It goes without saying, but we have to keep saying it. We need long-term finance. We need a source of finance as well as a way of pulling that together, and that is the basis for moving to the Holy Grail counter-cyclical housing investment, when we can build homes in response to population need, not just in response to fluctuations of the housing market. Government land is, of course, the essential ingredient. Where we're not using government land, our inclusionary planning tools allow us to have access to the rest of the land that is being used for residential development. We need an independent national advisory body, of course, whether we call it the National Housing Supply Council or something else, it's essential. And this is underpinned absolutely by local needs assessment and local strategies as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicole. We now have around 15 minutes for questions and answers before the morning tea break. If you'll raise your hand if you have a question or a comment for Professor Gurran. One down the front here. Microphone coming through. No, that's all right. It's the first hand I saw.
Okay. Meredith Sussex from AHURI. You talked about working with the grain of local market conditions. Did your work look at the issues around development viability assessment and the way in which that's developed in the UK and the US in the context of mandatory inclusionary zoning?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. That is always the moving feast. I think we need to be very careful about going too far down the rabbit hole. I would say there's three things I'd like to say about that. Firstly, when we talk about going with the grain of local market conditions, there used to be a conventional wisdom that you can only do inclusionary planning in very high markets, that it wasn't value anywhere else. Now, South Australia proved that wrong, and now when we talk about South Australia as a great example, people say, oh, well, they could do that in South Australia because they've got low demand. And so that's what I'm talking about when I say we need to work with the grain of local market conditions. When you're looking at a context like South Australia, where there's a very small gap between what a moderate income, for instance, household can afford to buy in the market and the price that it costs to actually build that dwelling, then an inclusionary planning requirement that simply requires a proportion of homes in the development to be sold at an affordable sales price is a feasible proposition, even via the back of the envelope feasibility analyses that actually go on in the sector when you're talking about acquiring land. I mean, that's the level at which feasibility assessment happens, and that's the time at which, when developers are acquiring land, that's the time at which they need to know what affordable housing requirements are going to apply. When we look to higher value markets, such as San Francisco is a good example, or the United Kingdom, of course there's much more value to be gained by a change in planning rules, such as a rezoning, a change in planning rules such as a variation of the planning rules, and a massive public investment such as the investment in rail, which has been rolled out in the United States, with the requirement that any city benefiting from rail funding has an inclusionary housing, an inclusionary zoning scheme or equivalent in place. So that's the level at which we need to think about feasibility, because we know that developers price land by profit minus costs, and the costs include the cost of building the housing plus all of the requirements around that. Now, if a requirement is that you need to make a proportion available at a particular sales price, as long as they're not gifting the capital cost of the development, as long as there's return for the bricks and mortar and labour, that is always able to be absorbed in the land. Otherwise, we're talking about a site that probably isn't a priority for housing development. But when we're talking about higher value sites as well, you may be able to actually get whole units costed. But the point is, you look across the continuum, you look at what types of housing you need and what might be viable, and maybe it's affordable home ownership if there's no subsidy available, for instance. So that becomes a more detailed site-by-site assessment. I don't want to talk for too long in response to this question, but it's a very important one. And the last point I'd like to make on it is that you can't look at high land markets, no matter how high value they are, as an alternative to funding the affordable housing sector. And when we talk about that, that's when I think we do run risks around making projects unviable, but also it's just not what an inclusionary planning approach is supposed to be.
More questions and comments from the floor? We have one down the front here, please. Microphone's on the way.
Thank you. Andy Nygaard from Swinburne Uni. Are there any lessons from this for the sort of different affordable housing strategies that you looked at on what is the impact on general house prices and rent levels? Does it make a dent in what the sort of market determined prices are?
I'm not sure how to approach that question because we could look at it in different ways. I mean, unfortunately in Australia, obviously we haven't had the enough affordable supply in the market to make a wider dent in the market, although perhaps you could argue South Australia, which has had is really the only state that's maintained affordability in the market over time. You could possibly say that the pipeline of affordable for sale and for rent may have made an impact there, but that becomes very difficult to be able to tell. If you're asking, does affordable rental housing stigmatise market housing? Absolutely not. No, but you're not asking that, so you're shaking your head.
No, it wasn't about the stigma. It was more about, so we heard about the sort of cost of subsidising housing from ministers and so earlier as well, and common rent assistance, housing benefits in the UK are ultimately determined by what the market drives prices to be in the secondary market, which is a much larger market than the affordable housing market. So are there any lessons in terms of how these supply strategies affect the average house price, so the average rent level, which then feeds into what the cost of subsidising affordable housing is?
I think what we need to move towards is actually having two sectors or more sectors, actually a much more diversified housing system, and that means that, you know, the unrestricted private market, if you like to use a very untechnical term, but the market where, you know, foreign investors might come and play, the market where you've got second homeowners, you know, the market that is purely driven by investment, that will really be driven by its own parameters, and the question of how much governments will have to subsidise to help people get into the market without assistance is simply determined by the size of the rest of the sector. So in Australia, we know our social and affordable housing market, you know, as we all know, is around about 4%. So everyone is in that other bigger market, which is being driven by a whole lot of demand-side factors, and therefore, if we want to house people properly, the bill for governments will grow. So, you know, as we all know, the bigger the social and affordable housing sector, then the less you need to pay on rental subsidies. But it doesn't cancel it out completely. I think that's a very complex question you asked, though, and perhaps it should go on the next AHURI agenda.
Or for discussion during the break. We have another question up the back.
Hi, thanks Nicole. Andrew Hannon, Community Housing Canberra. Just a question around affordable rentals and supply in that sense. Have you looked at what, as part of your research, looked at what growth was achieved through the NRAS program and sort of isolated that as a lever and assessed what's likely to happen to that supply of affordable rentals once those NRAS payments roll off? And also just interested in your perspective on to what extent do you think that Minister Sukkar talked about innovative thinking, you know, the bond aggregator, and also access to Commonwealth land sites. You know, to what extent do you think that those levers will be effective in resulting in a net increase in affordable rental supply in a post-NRAS world?
Yeah, I think there's probably a lot of people in this room who would like to answer and talk about those questions. They're very interesting, so I will try to be brief. NRAS, of course, there was the very deep study of NRAS led by Steve Rowley, also up on the AHURI website. Download it, read it. Certainly in New South Wales, I think part of the disappointment around the voluntary incentive scheme, which was really designed to help make NRAS even more attractive, perhaps it was more generous than it needed to be, but we probably would have seen more output had NRAS subsidies continued. We probably would have seen more in New South Wales, but of course now that is the question: what will happen to that stock as those rental subsidies expire? I can't answer that. It is something that we should be looking at through AHURI. It is a very, very important question. As to whether government land will increase the supply of affordable rental housing, well, of course it will, and the question is only how much land is now provided to the sector and the configuration of affordable housing across the continuum and market housing that we get. That is really what will determine the additionality.
Terrific. We can probably squeeze in just one more question if there's a pressing question. Otherwise, I think we have a number of interesting conversation threads to pick up during the morning tea break. So this is your chance to catch up on a bit of caffeine. I can see piles of food emerging at the back of the room there. And I'd like to particularly thank our networking sponsor, Spotless, for sponsoring the breaks. But would you please join me in thanking Nicole Gurran for her presentation?